How would you sum up George Pell and the life that he led?
He was a danger to children. Not only himself, but in his role as a priest, an auxiliary bishop, and an archbishop, he was a danger to children. He did not protect them. He put them in danger. He left them in danger. His career is an iconic career of a very high-ranking prelate in the Catholic Church who did not protect children.
I'm innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me.
Imagine the third most powerful man in the Catholic Church, the Vatican's treasurer who controlled billions of dollars, standing in an Australian courtroom as a jury finds him guilty of sexually abusing two choir boys in a cathedral. Cardinal George Pell's conviction sent shockwaves around the world, the highest-ranking Catholic official ever convicted of child sexual abuse. But the story doesn't end there. After 404 days in solitary confinement, Australia's highest court overturned his conviction in a decision that divided a nation and reignited the global debate about justice, faith, and institutional power. You're about to hear how one of the most powerful men in the Catholic Church went from defending the institution against abuse allegations to becoming the face of its greatest scandal. This case exposed decades of cover-ups, challenged the concept of justice itself, and left survivors wondering if the truth would ever truly prevail. Stay with me because this story will make you question everything you thought you knew about power, accountability, and the price of institutional loyalty. George Pell was born into a world where the Catholic Church represented not just faith, but power, prestige, and unquestioned moral authority. Born on June 8, 1941 in Ballarat, Australia, Pell grew up in a devoutly Catholic family during an era when the Church's influence permeated every aspect of Australian society. From his earliest days, it seemed destined that he would serve the institution that had shaped his worldview and values. Pell's path to power within the Catholic hierarchy was marked by intelligence, ambition, and an unwavering loyalty to conservative Catholic doctrine. He was ordained as a priest in 1966, during a time of great change and upheaval within the Church as Vatican II modernized many traditional practices. But Pell remained committed to traditional values and conservative theology, a stance that would define his entire career and ultimately elevate him to the highest levels of church leadership. His rise through the ranks was meteoric by church standards. Pell became a bishop, then an archbishop, demonstrating the kind of administrative skills and theological knowledge that Rome valued. He was appointed Archbishop of Melbourne in 1996, and later Archbishop of Sydney in 2001, two of the most prestigious positions in the Australian Catholic Church. But it was his appointment as Vatican Treasurer in 2014 that truly marked Pell as one of the most powerful men in the Catholic world. Pope Francis personally selected Pell to reform the Vatican's finances and bring transparency to an institution that had long been criticized for its secretive financial practices. As the Vatican's economy minister, Pell controlled billions of dollars and held a position of trust that extended far beyond Australia to the global Catholic community. To the outside world, Pell represented everything that was supposed to be noble about the Catholic Church. He was intelligent, articulate, and seemingly devoted to the institution's moral mission. He was a frequent media presence, defending Catholic doctrine and speaking authoritatively on matters of faith and morals. His conservative views made him controversial in some circles, but also earned him respect among traditional Catholics who saw him as a defender of authentic church teaching. But even as Pell rose to international prominence, shadows from his past were beginning to lengthen. The Diocese of Ballarat, where Pell had served as a young priest, was emerging as one of the epicenters of the Catholic Church's child sexual abuse crisis in Australia. Multiple priests who had served in the area during Pell's time there were being accused of horrific crimes against children, and questions were being raised about who knew what and when. Ballarat had been a hunting ground for predatory priests, with at least 27 priests associated with the diocese later convicted of child sexual abuse. The scale of abuse was staggering. Hundreds of children had been victimized by men who were supposed to be their spiritual guides and protectors. The impact on the community was devastating, with many survivors struggling with trauma, addiction, and mental health issues that would plague them for the rest of their lives. During this period in the 1970s and 1980s, Pell was serving in various capacities within the diocese, including as a young priest and later in administrative roles. He lived and worked alongside priests who were systematically abusing children, slept in the same quarters, and participated in the same meetings where decisions were made about priest assignments and transfers. The question that would haunt Pell for decades was simple: what did he know and when did he know it? As allegations against his former colleagues mounted, survivors and their advocates began to focus attention on Pell's role in what appeared to be a systematic cover-up of abuse. They argued that it was impossible for someone in his position to have been unaware of the abuse that was occurring around him. The establishment of Australia's Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse in 2012 marked a turning point in the country's reckoning with decades of institutional child abuse. The Commission was given broad powers to investigate how institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, had responded to allegations of abuse and whether they had protected children or protected perpetrators. George Pell initially welcomed the Royal Commission, publicly stating that he saw it as an opportunity to help victims and clear the air. But as the Commission's work progressed and its focus turned increasingly toward the Catholic Church, Pell's public statements became more defensive. He complained about what he called a press campaign against the Church and suggested that the focus on Catholic institutions was disproportionate. The Commission's investigation into the Catholic Church was exhaustive and damning. It found that thousands of children had been abused by Catholic clergy and religious over decades, and that the Church hierarchy had consistently prioritized protecting the institution over protecting children. The Commission documented patterns of cover-ups, transfers of offending priests to new parishes, and a culture of secrecy that enabled abuse to continue unchecked. When Pell was called to testify before the Royal Commission, the proceedings attracted massive public attention. Here was one of the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church being questioned under oath about his knowledge of and response to child sexual abuse. Pell's testimony, delivered via video link from the Vatican due to his claimed ill health, was closely watched by abuse survivors and the general public. During his testimony, Pell acknowledged that the Church had made enormous mistakes in dealing with abuse allegations. However, he consistently denied personal knowledge of specific abuse cases and rejected suggestions that he had been involved in cover-ups. He portrayed himself as someone who had been working to address the Church's problems rather than someone who had contributed to them. Despite his denials and his position of power, allegations against Pell personally began to emerge. The most serious of these came from survivors who alleged that Pell himself had sexually abused them when he was a young priest and later as Archbishop of Melbourne. These were not just allegations against the institution he represented, but personal accusations that he had committed the same crimes as the priests he was now claiming to hold accountable. The allegations that would ultimately lead to criminal charges related to incidents that allegedly occurred in the late 1990s when Pell was Archbishop of Melbourne. Two choir boys who were 12 and 13 years old at the time alleged that Pell had sexually abused them in the sacristy of St. Patrick's Cathedral following Sunday solemn mass. The details of the allegations, when they eventually became public, were shocking in their specificity and their violation of the sacred space of the cathedral. The survivors alleged that Pell had discovered them drinking sacramental wine in the cathedral's sacristy and had then sexually assaulted them. One of the alleged victims had died of a drug overdose in 2014, before the allegations became public, but the other survivor came forward to police. What made these allegations particularly explosive was not just their serious nature, but the context in which they allegedly occurred. Pell was at the height of his power and influence as Archbishop of Melbourne, a respected public figure who regularly appeared on television and was consulted by media on moral and ethical issues. The idea that such a prominent religious leader could have been secretly abusing children even as he publicly defended the Church's moral authority was deeply shocking to many Catholics and the broader community. In June 2017, Victoria Police announced that they had charged Cardinal George Pell with historical sexual assault offenses. The announcement sent shockwaves around the world. This was the third most senior official in the Catholic Church, a man who controlled the Vatican's finances and was one of Pope Francis's closest advisors. The charges represented an unprecedented challenge to the Catholic hierarchy and raised questions about how the Vatican would respond. Pell immediately declared his innocence and vowed to fight the charges. He took a leave of absence from his Vatican role and returned to Australia to face the legal proceedings. In a statement, he said he was looking forward to his day in court so that he could clear his name and demonstrate his innocence. The Catholic Church's response was carefully measured. The Vatican expressed support for Pell while emphasizing the importance of the legal process running its course. Pope Francis did not immediately remove Pell from his position, instead granting him a leave of absence while he dealt with the legal proceedings. This approach drew criticism from abuse survivors and their advocates, who argued that the Church should have acted more decisively to distance itself from Pell. The charges against Pell were initially suppressed by a court order that prevented Australian media from reporting on them. The suppression order was put in place to ensure that Pell could receive a fair trial without prejudicial publicity. However, international media, particularly in the United States and Europe, reported extensively on the charges, creating a bizarre situation where the story was widely known internationally but could not be reported in Australia. The trial of Cardinal George Pell began in earnest in 2018, representing one of the most significant legal proceedings in Australian history. The prosecution case relied heavily on the testimony of one surviving victim, as the other alleged victim had died years earlier. The prosecution argued that Pell had used his position of authority and the sacred setting of the cathedral to commit serious sexual offenses against vulnerable children. The prosecution's case faced significant challenges from the beginning. The alleged offenses had occurred more than 20 years earlier, making physical evidence extremely difficult to obtain. The case essentially came down to the word of one alleged victim against that of one of the most senior figures in the Catholic Church. The prosecution had to convince a jury that the allegations were true beyond reasonable doubt, despite the passage of time and the lack of corroborating physical evidence. Pell's defense team mounted a vigorous challenge to the allegations. They argued that the alleged offenses could not have occurred as described, pointing to the layout of the cathedral, the timing of masses, and Pell's usual practices as archbishop. They suggested that Pell would have been greeting parishioners after Mass, as was his custom, making it impossible for him to have committed the alleged offenses in the time frame suggested by the prosecution. The defense also highlighted what they argued were inconsistencies in the surviving victim's account and questioned why he had not come forward earlier if the abuse had actually occurred. They painted a picture of a case built on unreliable memories from decades earlier and suggested that the charges were the result of a witch hunt against the Catholic Church rather than a genuine pursuit of justice. After extensive deliberation, the jury delivered a verdict that shocked the world. Cardinal George Pell was found guilty on one charge of sexual penetration of a child under 16 and 4 charges of an indecent act with or in the presence of a child under 16. The conviction made Pell the most senior Catholic cleric ever to be found guilty of child sexual abuse, a historic moment that reverberated around the globe. The conviction was initially subject to the same suppression order that had prevented reporting of the charges, meaning that while Pell had been found guilty, the Australian public could not be told about the verdict. This created an extraordinary situation where one of Australia's most prominent public figures had been convicted of serious criminal offences, but the news could not be reported in his home country. When the suppression order was eventually lifted in February 2019, the news dominated headlines around the world. The conviction was seen as a watershed moment in the Catholic Church's abuse crisis, demonstrating that even the most senior church officials could be held accountable for their actions. Abuse survivors and their advocates hailed the conviction as vindication of their long struggle for justice. Pell was sentenced to 6 years in prison with a non-parole period of 3 years and 8 months. The sentencing judge described the offenses as serious and noted the particular vulnerability of the child victims and the breach of trust involved. Pell was immediately taken into custody to begin serving his sentence. marking a dramatic fall from grace for one of the most powerful men in the Catholic world. Cardinal Pell's time in prison was unlike that of most inmates. Due to his high profile and the nature of his crimes, he was kept in protective custody and spent much of his time in solitary confinement. He was housed in a single cell and had limited contact with other prisoners, both for his own safety and because of the security risks his presence posed to the prison system. During his imprisonment, Pell maintained his innocence and his legal team continued to fight the conviction through the appeals process. His supporters argued that he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice, while his critics contended that he was finally facing the consequences of decades of institutional protection. The case divided public opinion in Australia and internationally. Many Catholics struggled to reconcile the image of Pell as a senior church leader with his conviction as a child sex offender. Some maintained their belief in his innocence and argued that he was being scapegoated for the broader failures of the Catholic Church. Others saw his conviction as long overdue accountability for institutional abuse and cover-ups. After serving 405 days in prison, Pell's conviction was overturned by the High Court of Australia in April 2020. The High Court found that the jury should have had reasonable doubt about Pell's guilt and that the conviction should not have stood. The decision was unanimous, with all 7 judges agreeing that the conviction should be quashed. The High Court's decision to overturn Pell's conviction was based on legal principles rather than a determination of whether the alleged abuse had actually occurred. The court found that the evidence presented at trial, when viewed as a whole, should have left the jury with reasonable doubt about Pell's guilt. The judges concluded that the jury had not properly considered evidence that contradicted the prosecution's case. The High Court's reasoning focused on the implausibility of the alleged offenses occurring as described, given the physical layout of the cathedral, the timing of events, and Pell's usual practices as archbishop. The court found that there was evidence that cast doubt on whether Pell would have had the opportunity to commit the alleged offenses in the manner described by the surviving victim. The decision was highly controversial and divided legal experts and the general public. Supporters of Pell hailed it as vindication of his innocence and proof that he had been wrongly convicted. Critics argued that the High Court had effectively second-guessed the jury's assessment of the evidence and had prioritized legal technicalities over justice for abuse victims. The surviving victim, speaking through his lawyer, expressed disappointment with the decision but accepted the court's ruling. He maintained that his allegations were true and that he had endured a traumatic legal process in his pursuit of justice. Abuse survivors and their advocates expressed concern that the decision would discourage other victims from coming forward and would be seen as proof that the justice system could not hold powerful figures accountable. Throughout the legal proceedings, the Catholic Church's response to the Pell case was carefully managed but ultimately revealed deep divisions within the institution. Initially, the Vatican and church leaders expressed support for the legal process while maintaining that Pell deserved the presumption of innocence. However, as the case progressed, the Church's position became more complex and politically charged. When Pell was convicted, the Vatican announced that it would conduct its own canonical investigation into the allegations, separate from the criminal proceedings. This investigation was intended to determine whether Pell should face internal church sanctions, regardless of the outcome of his criminal appeals. However, the Vatican suspended this investigation pending the outcome of Pell's appeals, drawing criticism from those who argued that the Church should have acted more decisively. The Royal Commission's findings about Pell, released after his conviction was overturned, painted a damning picture of his role in the Church's response to abuse. The Commission found that Pell was aware of child sexual abuse by clergy as early as 1973 and that he had failed to take adequate steps to address the problem. The findings suggested that Pell had prioritized protecting the Church's reputation over protecting children, even if he had not personally committed abuse. These findings raised serious questions about Pell's fitness to continue in church leadership roles, regardless of his criminal conviction being overturned. However, Pell's advanced age and health issues meant that he was unlikely to return to active ministry in any significant capacity. He died in January 2023 at the age of 81, having lived his final years as a controversial figure whose legacy was forever linked to the Church's abuse crisis. The Pell case had implications that extended far beyond one man's guilt or innocence. It became a symbol of broader issues around institutional power, accountability, and the treatment of abuse survivors. The case highlighted the challenges of prosecuting historical abuse cases, particularly when they involve powerful defendants and limited physical evidence. For the Catholic Church, the case represented both a moment of reckoning and a missed opportunity for genuine reform. While some saw Pell's initial conviction as proof that even the most senior church leaders could be held accountable, his eventual acquittal raised questions about whether true justice was possible within existing legal frameworks. The case also highlighted the ongoing trauma experienced by abuse survivors and the additional burden placed on them by high-profile legal proceedings. The surviving victim in the Pell case had to endure years of legal proceedings, intense media scrutiny, and public questioning of his credibility. His courage in coming forward, regardless of the ultimate legal outcome, demonstrated the ongoing commitment of survivors to seeking justice and accountability. The death of Cardinal George Pell in January 2023 marked the end of a controversial life that had been defined by both significant achievement and serious allegations. Pell's supporters remembered him as a faithful servant of the Church who had been wrongly accused and had suffered a miscarriage of justice. His critics saw him as a symbol of the Church's failure to adequately address abuse and protect children. The truth about what happened in St. Patrick's Cathedral in the 1990s may never be definitively established. The High Court's decision to overturn Pell's conviction was based on legal standards of proof rather than a determination of whether the alleged abuse occurred. The surviving victim maintained his allegations were true, while Pell went to his grave maintaining his innocence. What is clear is that the case exposed fundamental problems with how institutions handle allegations of abuse and how the justice system deals with historical cases involving powerful defendants. The Pell case became a lightning rod for broader debates about power, privilege, and accountability that continue to resonate today. The Cardinal George Pell case represents one of the most significant and controversial criminal proceedings in Australian history. It challenged fundamental assumptions about religious authority, institutional accountability, and the pursuit of justice. Whether viewed as a miscarriage of justice or as accountability finally catching up with institutional power, the case marked a watershed moment in Australia's reckoning with child sexual abuse. Pell's rise to the highest levels of the Catholic Church and his subsequent fall from grace illustrate the complex dynamics of institutional power and the ways that allegations of abuse can challenge even the most established authorities. His conviction and subsequent acquittal raised profound questions about the nature of justice and the challenges of prosecuting historical abuse cases. The surviving victim's courage in coming forward and enduring years of legal proceedings deserves recognition, regardless of the ultimate legal outcome. His willingness to challenge one of the most powerful figures in the Catholic Church demonstrated the ongoing commitment of abuse survivors to seeking accountability and justice. The broader Catholic community continues to grapple with the implications of the Pell case and its impact on faith, trust, and institutional credibility. The case serves as a reminder of the ongoing need for transparency, accountability, and genuine reform within religious institutions. Cardinal George Pell died as he had lived his final years, a controversial figure whose legacy was forever intertwined with questions about abuse, power, and justice. His case will continue to be studied and debated as a crucial chapter in the ongoing story of institutional accountability and the fight for justice by abuse survivors. The questions raised by the Pell case, about power, accountability, and the protection of children remain as relevant today as they were when the allegations first surfaced. The case serves as both a cautionary tale about unchecked institutional power and a testament to the courage of those who are willing to challenge authority in pursuit of truth and justice.